So we're live? Okay, so we can start? Yeah, Kai?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, we're live. Welcome to the EIP0 AMA. We have a bunch of awesome people here with us, so let's just go through introductions. Start over there.
Hi, I'm Hudson Jameson. My nickname online and on the Reddit is Subtacular. I work for the Ethereum Foundation, and I'm excited to be here.
Hi, I'm also excited. I'm Afri Schödern. My online handle is 5CHDN, and I'm affiliated with Parity.
Hey guys, really excited to do this and hopefully hear some great questions from the audience. My name's Lane Reddig. I'm a core developer on the EWASM team, and I'm helping Hudson organize the All Core Devs call.
I'm Nick Johnson. I work for the Ethereum Foundation and the lead of ENS, and I'm also an editor for the EIP's repository. And like everyone else here, I'm excited to be here.
I'm Griff from Giveth, and I'm just going to moderate the panel.
Hi, my name is Nathan Field from the Dowston Board.
Hi, I'm Maciej. I work for Parity as a core developer.
Nice. Well,
And let them know we have some other people here as well.
yeah, we have a bunch of people also that will probably jump in. We have Aragon and Uport and some other Giveth people, so they'll probably jump into this hot seat if they have a question they want to attack. But we don't have any questions yet, so definitely go to the YouTube channel and put down some questions if you have anything to ask. The topic is governance, and I guess just to seed the panel, can we go one by one and ask what are the easiest wins that we can do to improve governance right now? That's it.
Yeah, so to me the easiest wins to improve governance would be to basically solidify current processes, document current processes, because a lot of them are nebulous. Some of them were nebulous by design in the beginning because we were either so small it didn't matter, or we wanted to keep it nebulous to avoid centralization or the idea of centralization. But now there's starting to be a real need for more formalizing of governance structures within Ethereum. So I think that the quickest win is going to be documentation and a little more formalization of current structures.
Oh yeah, I second that. Actually writing down how things should work is one thing we can get done quickly, at least on a technical level. Curious how this would work out if we want to write something like a constitution, or like writing down the philosophical or ethical cornerstones of the Ethereum governance. This is like probably more involved.
I second, or I guess third, what these guys said. I think seeking to understand the current processes, because as you guys said, it's kind of been very informal, kind of by design up to now. So understanding, documenting, which I think is a great step towards enfranchising more people in the community to understand, what the existing processes are and how they can participate and make sure their voice is heard. Another thing I think we can do is exactly what we're doing, which is just bringing people together to talk about it. It's a pretty basic, low-hanging fruit. Not a lot has happened. That hasn't happened a whole lot up to now. And then finally, I would add also learning from other communities outside the kind of Ethereum blockchain bubble. Governance is not a new problem. So I'm trying to learn from fields like law and political science, etc.
I think we also need to improve communication channels, be more coherent about where the right place to communicate about something is, make sure that everyone can be heard, and that we sort of collect feedback and establish consensus and so on in ways that are transparent and that make it easier for people to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, so I'm echoing Lane. I think more meetups of this kind will be very fruitful. And then I think also seeding as many as possible different formal experimentations with governance system, kind of to let evolution takes place and find out the, so to say, right system.
Yeah, so I think I will also go next idea, figuring out what the right application channels are and what the different groups that have different interests and different stakes into the community where they are, where they hang out, and trying to find out ways for their voices to be listened to. This was probably like the very first line of like making the governance more inclusive and more legitimate.
And then, so how do we go about in doing that? Do we need to hire somebody, or what is the most actionable item so we can actually start implementing some of these improvements?
It'd be cool if there was someone who was a blockchain governance expert we could hire. If you're out there, hit us up. We would love to talk to you. But for real though, just writing it down is where my mind goes.
Yeah, but who? Or like how? So like, yeah, we need this.
Yeah, I'm writing down the core dev meeting stuff after EdCon. So that's one thing I'm doing. Anybody who is very involved in a specific process probably should.
Yeah.
So Nick and Hudson were really fantastic yesterday. They sat down and we did a live stream of having them explain EIP process, the current EIP process. So that's sort of a form of documentation. I mean, that could be transcribed or written. I'll just throw out there's an upcoming book by Antonopoulos and Gavin Wood called Mastering Ethereum, and I'm working on a governance chapter for that book, which is pretty hard because a lot of this stuff has not been written down before, but would really appreciate contributions to that as well. It's all open source.
Well, you guys got anything else you want to chat about on governance?
Well, we can start a GIP process, maybe a governance improvement proposals, like a separate thread just for starting.
I feel like that means to have an improvement proposal, you have to have something to start
Yeah,
with.
can be like any proposal will be improvement.
GIP0.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what else do you guys want to talk about?
I
There aren't
have,
any questions.
well, I have, I guess I'll jump in the hot seat.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
You're good. You're
Yeah.
good. You have a chair here. So one of the sessions that was towards the end of the day yesterday was about. So we had it was kind of a two-parter. One was like defining like what is the community, and I think one of the conclusions that came out of that discussion was perhaps community might not even be like the right word. Like it might not be all-encompassing enough to describe the just like everybody who has a stake in governance or could perhaps influence the governance process. And then the second part was, okay, well, maybe this isn't a community, but of all of these stakeholders, how can we best collect signals from these people that kind of accurately describes how they feel about a particular change that's being proposed, in particular like consensus changes where everybody kind of has to agree to it. And so we listed out all of the potential ways that these different entities could be signaling, and then how to collect and aggregate those signals, and kind of had a shared agreement in the group that having reliable, accurate, diverse signaling tools and signal aggregators that people who care about these proposals can use to gauge support or opposition, and that can help the core devs make decisions. It can help miners and users and all of these different decision makers and stakeholders, participate and finally come to consensus or some other conclusion about a change that's being proposed. So I think that was an actionable thing to come out of that, was that maybe we should start building signaling tools and signal aggregation tools. And there was some explicitly vocally expressed support for funding the development of these kinds of tools, open source, decentralized, so that anybody can run it, and we don't have the EthereumConsensus.com kind of dictating what everything is. So that I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any cool outcomes from the conversations yesterday?
There was a really interesting one where we talked about providing legal and social support to developers who are involved in kind of sticky governance situations or even in coding on the blockchain, because there's a lot of legal implications of coding something that is immutable, something that is or not necessarily even immutable, something that is like unchanging. So if someone puts something illegal in the blockchain, for instance, are the coders liable, stuff like that. So we kind of came up with the idea to hire a lawyer of some kind to map out what legal protections we have automatically and which ones we could gain. I learned yesterday about professional liability insurance, which is something I didn't even know existed until now, which basically protects very certain job situations that you might, come under fire for. And yeah, so that was the legal side. The social side was just supporting each other mainly and kind of growing a thick skin from trolls.
Yeah.
On the topic of signals, something that came up yesterday that I found quite interesting is that there seems to be a lot of interest in sort of variations, like new kind of ideas around democracy, things like liquid democracy and quadratic voting. I think there's a sense that things like coin votes are not ideal and they don't have sort of the greatest signal strength today for various reasons. But it would be very interesting to see, I don't think the infrastructure for this exists at all. I know some teams like Democracy Earth are working on this, and teams like Aragon may have a role to play in this as well. But if we could find a way to have people in the community vote, delegate voting, that kind of thing. Like one of the issues with coin votes is that very few people vote, right? And again, various reasons for that: cold storage, or just disinterest, or just they don't know what's going on. But if people had a mechanism by which they could sort of delegate votes to sort of trusted, individuals or organizations or contracts or something, I think that could be an interesting experiment to run around improving the quality of signals.
I guess I have a question for other panelists, which is, what do you think is most urgent to tackle? It may not be the lowest hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
It may be very difficult indeed, but what should we be focusing on first, besides signalling, which I guess has already been brought up as a candidate? Anyone?
Which process should we tackle, or like which problem in
Which
like a wide
problem?
scope?
Yeah. What is the most pressing issue in governance today that that we should be trying to address?
I'm just looking at the list we came up with
Yeah.
yesterday over
Yeah.
there, because some of them that I thought belong on that list are over there.
Maybe other than signaling,
Yeah.
I mean, documentation is definitely a big one, and I think an output or a result of doing that would be lowering the barrier to participating.
Yep.
So right now, because it's undocumented, people kind of feel like it's an insider thing. Whereas if it is documented and it's like, go here and comment here, then it's like, it's a lot more inclusive, and I think it'll just lower the barrier to people participating.
I mean, maybe it would just be nice to hire a 18-year-old girl from LA to just start tweeting and spamming social media, because I do feel like a lot of the stuff is documented, maybe not really well, but it is there. Like if you want to ask questions in the all devs call, you just go to GitHub and put it in there, right?
But people don't know that, so how do we,
Yeah.
right, there is no single trusted repository yet. I mean, that's one
why
of my
the Ethereum
goals, yeah.
Foundation needs to hire an 18-year-old girl in LA to just like attack Twitter, right?
Or some Russians?
Spam everything.
Attack
Yeah.
tweet.
Yeah.
Or some Russians.
Yeah.
Yeah, they seem to have that down pat.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Chris says that it would be really nice if people that were interacting with governance would make more blog posts and put their ideas out there so that everyone knows what the thought leaders are thinking. And also, maybe we could start a chat room in Riot or Telegram about governance that people could throw ideas
So
in.
just to be clear, we do have one already. It's gitter.im/Ethereum/governance. There is a public chat room anyone can join. It's not super active, but it kind of becomes active certain times. It's kind of bursty, but more people should join that conversation.
And there is, I mean, it might be, this is more EIP perhaps, but there's the Magicians Forum,
Yeah.
and then perhaps something comes out of this gathering if it's for philosophy specific.
Let me take 20 seconds to explain, because this is an important topic. There's some confusion. People may not be familiar. There's an initiative started by Greg Colvin and Jamie Pitts very recently, earlier this year, called the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians. and it was in some ways kind of modeled after technical governance committees in organizations such as the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, is that correct?
Yes.
To bring together, kind of some of the best engineering minds in Ethereum today to address the technical side of governance. So there's an online forum, I think it's ethereum-magicians.org.
Yes.
Which has become, again, quite active lately. There was an in-person gathering of this fellowship in Paris around ETHCC. There will be another one in Berlin in July. And this group, one of the things that we're discussing here is whether we need a second initiative to talk about we're calling it the philosophical side of governance, which is the non-technical aspects of it. So we haven't made any decisions about that yet, but we'd love to hear what the community thinks.
Philosophical sounds a lot better than political.
Yeah. And ethical and, economic. Yep.
So I do have a question from Rasmus. He says, this is more of a specific question, but what are possible solutions to make it harder for people to sell their votes? For example, in a direct democracy or a liquid democracy setting. Does anyone have ideas on that?
That's a great question.
Jump on.
Yeah.
Open seats.
Oh, introduce
yourself.
Hello, I'm Jordi Bailina. I'm a Ethereum developer mainly. I work in Giveth. I work in many open source projects in the space. It's an interesting question. Selling, of course, when you have a token, you can easily make, for example, not to avoid that you cannot transfer to maybe another account, but you can always sell your private key. So transfers, it's always possible. I think, but for governance and for liquid democracy, I think the best way to handle that is not a technical solution. It's a matter of education. For me, in a decentralized world, we need to understand that the peers, the people that belongs to an entity, to a decentralized entity, they have this responsibility. They only don't have the power. With the power associated with the power is a responsibility, and the responsibility of thinking in the entity, the responsibility of taking part, even if it's in a single liquid democracy delegation part. But indeed, this delegation, you need this responsibility. And I think the best way to handle is more about education, about explaining the importance of this act. And no, this is not technical. It's just a matter of explaining. If there is of course, it's going to be always a very small amount of people that will not follow their rules. But if it's a small, it should not affect the governance of the full entity. So the important is to have organizations where most of the people understand the importance. They get this commitment of thinking on the entity that they belong on.
I think also e-voting in general is a big open problem, like in the traditional world as well. Like for a secure voting system in a democracy, you need to be able to prove that you need to build a system where you can't sell your vote and you can't be coerced into to voting a certain way, and that also implies that you actually can't prove to anyone how you voted, which is a really big problem trying to solve in a voting system, especially since ultimately, even if you use incredibly clever cryptography, someone can literally lean over your shoulder and watch you vote.
Do you have any thoughts, Tom?
Well, I think there is no way to avoid renting votes. But tying up addresses,
Can you guys speak louder?
yeah, there is no way to avoid renting votes, like selling. But one way to kind of like avoid permanent sale of keys is to tie it up to social identities, which make it less desirable. You won't sell your private key if it's tied to your Twitter account, for example. Very easy.
I want to hop in on this one because I've got strong feelings.
Yeah.
Please.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Luke. I'm on the Aragon team. I'm very involved in kind of researching voting, especially trying to do so on chain, and it's a really hard problem. Like everything everybody said here is like totally like legitimate concerns. And I think when you think about governance in general, it's true that like regardless of how you do voting, whether you do one person, one vote, money is going to have a huge influence, whether it's directly through like sock puppet accounts and or like directly through like bribes or like buying votes. Money has influence. The important thing you need to think about is checks and balances. So if you look at the Ethereum process now, if we did coin voting and we do it as a signal, it's one input in multiple factors, right? So if you do liquid democracy, you legitimize that process, and people are participating in that, it's a signal. And even if somebody is buying votes, that's a signal too. You just have the transparency to see where that information is coming from. And other people in the process, including the core developers, also have like a piece and a check on that balance. So in order to make governance work, you need to have multiple like pieces. True decentralization is like separating powers and having checks and balances. So you can have coin voting, but you also need to have these other processes as well.
If I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like that means that on-chain governance could be quite hard because it tends to be based on a smaller number of signals, things like votes, right? Am I accurate there? Or?
I think on-chain voting is hard because most of the ways that people are doing it has basically one decision function at the end.
Right, exactly.
So it's like you have a single vote and that controls the outcome of some on-chain process or protocol upgrade, which is like very, very brittle, very prone to abuse. But you can design on-chain processes that have multiple factors as well. And I mean, it's challenging and it's an interesting problem and we can get there, but the most decentralized way that you can do it at this point is to just have many different signals and many different decision makers, right. All acting individually.
Which, to be clear, is how things happen informally today in Ethereum.
That's exactly how it works.
Yeah.
I don't know if people realize that that's how it works. Like everybody can participate in sending signals and being involved in the process, because right now the EIP process is the most well-documented, most legitimate process. We don't have like a legitimized coin voting process as a secondary signal that people are actively using. And I think that's a huge improvement that we could make. We can improve on those signals, which is what people are talking about. But that fundamentally doesn't change the process. The process as it stands is everybody can participate. Everybody has a voice, and that's the most decentralized you can get.
Trenton Van Epps has a comment along those lines. Social media is so noisy with trolls and all this stuff on Reddit. It's hard to sift through true sentiment on controversial EIPs and things like that. So is there a way to deal with that, or what do you guys have a comment? Signaling?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the core of the challenge here is like, personally, I like follow all of these discussions, and I can't really tell what's real, what's fake, what's one guy who's really loud on Twitter, and what like community consensus actually is. So figuring out how to create processes that reduce the noise and increase the signal strength for these different stakeholders that all have different point of views, and like separate those out so I can look somewhere and be like, okay, this is kind of the sentiment from like ETH holders and investors, which coin voting might be a good signal for. This is the sentiment from developers that like you've got core development teams, and these are the people that are actively involved in that process. What are they saying individually? That's another very strong signal. Twitter, Reddit is probably not a very easy signal to like find the signal through the noise, but it is one of many signals that's useful. Hopefully we can improve on that.
I just want to reiterate from the perspective of a core developer, this is one of the hardest things. Is, we care enormously. I'll speak for myself. I care enormously what the community thinks for whatever definition of community you want to use, but it's very difficult to know. I mean, I have my own biases and my own sets of filters, and they're somewhat effective. When I'm reading on Reddit, I can kind of sort of figure out where the trolls are and maybe who's having more meaningful conversation. The Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians Forum has been awesome up to now. I certainly hope it stays that way, but it may not stay that way forever. I just wanted to reiterate, when we came together as a group yesterday and we asked people what sort of governance topic is most important to you, and again, I'm sort of glancing at this wall. I think I tweeted some photos of it yesterday. Like the top 3 topics were all this. They were all like, what is the community? How do we hear the voice of the community? The signal question, voting, that kind of stuff. So we collectively here care a great deal about that, and we have some creative ideas, which John described a moment ago, but we don't have solutions yet.
Yeah, I think also having a reputation system, like a blockchain reputation system, maybe several reputation systems, is very efficient in reducing noise.
So I'm a little cynical about reputation systems, because as soon as you set up a metric, people will game it and people will optimize for that metric rather than for the thing you're actually trying to capture. It's difficult to summarize in a few words. Cory Doctorow has actually written a lot about it, including his latest novel about sort of reputation dystopias.
Walk away.
Well, it very much depends on what is your reputation flow control mechanism. But if you had like the most conservative one and assume that the only way to gain reputation is by the existing reputation holders to allocate more reputation to certain
reputation or your reputarchy, and that's the one factor, right? Then you have concentration of reputation. You've got a boys club at the top of the pyramid. Reputation is really a useful tool, but it needs to be one signal out of many, right? Like it can help increase that signal to noise ratio, but you can't feel like reputation is the panacea for governance. We've designed the perfect reputation system. We can rely on that. Governance is complex because there's multiple stakeholders and it's always changing. You need to cover all of those bases and include everybody in that process.
Reputarchies are cool. I'm going to go with some more questions here because they're starting to pile up now.
Awesome.
Is there a way to make a system where 33% of the vote is weighted on voting Ether owners, 33% for verified Ethereum developers, and 33% on ecosystem users?
What happened to the 1%?
That's the 1%.
Tokenization at the end is, if you think in a system that's one token, one vote, you can create a system of that, and then it's just a matter of sharing, distributing the tokens to the people that get holder. The problem is not this. The problem is, okay, why 33 and not 50? And of those 33 developers, which devs should have it? And then it's when we enter in the reputation. So technically, that side probably is the easiest one. It's not easy, but it's the easiest part of the governance of a governance system.
I think any arbitrary sort of governance structure like the one that is described here is fairly easy. I mean, yes, there's some challenges around tokenization and preventing Sybil attacks and this and that, but at high level, I think it's doable. But I don't think it solves the problem because we're not going to get it right on the first attempt. And then it has this meta question, how do you govern the governance, right? We still need to have a mechanism to go in and change it in the future. So this is why, personally speaking, I'm skeptical of doing this sort of thing in code or on chain.
I don't think we're ever going to get a single figure that accurately reflects the sentiment of an entire community. I think probably the best we can do is come up with ways to fairly measure as many groups of stakeholders as possible, and it'll probably be a different way to measure each one. And then make sure that information is widely available. And ultimately, most of these governance, if not all of these governance decisions, come down to whether and how we should implement a hard fork to change some stuff. Mm-hmm. And then participants in the community can use all of that information to decide whether it's a good idea to try it, because ultimately the hard fork comes down to people adopting it or not. And we want to make the decisions that result in, I think, the most coherent community and aligns the most incentives, and all of that is input into that. But I don't think we can just say, yes, 98% say yes, therefore do it.
A thought. So one thing that came up yesterday was this idea of making forks less scary. And so I think it's important to take into account, in light of the facts, as far as we can tell, that there is no perfect governance system, and in a lot of cases you're not going to have 100% consensus, and in those cases you shouldn't, people who really feel strongly disagree, shouldn't have to follow the rest of the herd. If they want to fork off, it shouldn't be that painful. I mean, obviously starting a new chain is kind of its own, comes with its own unique problems, but nonetheless it shouldn't be like an apocalyptic kind of scenario to have a split. And so I think those ideas, I wasn't in this session, but I think the ideas around making forks or splits less painful can help to ease some of the anxiety just around, oh, we don't have perfect consensus for this decision, but the core devs feel strongly about it, even though some influential members or some highly opinionated members in the community might not. So that's just a thought.
I guess on a semi-related note, in terms of making sure that a wide number of stakeholders have visibility in this, one of the things those of us who can do, who have a louder voice for one reason or another, is to effectively delegate our vote to the community or a set of stakeholders to say, I'm here today and I'm conveying the opinion of, as I perceive it, of this group, rather than using my weight to throw my own opinion around, and you can sort of try and amplify groups that you think are underrepresented.
So that's something that Hudson's been doing, I think, in all core devs, right? You've done a great job of kind of trying to convey the community sentiment.
Yeah. I try to get people on, even if they're not a core dev, when a contentious issue comes up. So for instance, the issuance reduction for miners that we completed during the last hard fork, there were people who made a lot of good economic arguments for and against that, and so I had a few of them on the core dev call, and I thought that was a pretty good idea, so that it wasn't just highly technical, non-economic people, or not fully economic people speaking on the subject during the call.
Changing the topic a little bit, Richard Lopez asked, can someone compare coin voting versus curated registry token mechanisms?
I can.
Like TCRs?
Yeah.
You want to go for it?
Go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to make an attempt, and then you can correct me. Yeah, so coin voting is fairly straightforward, at least in the way it's done today. Basically, the idea is one coin, one vote, right? So if I hold 100 ETH, and you hold 1 ETH, then my vote counts 100 times more than yours. Like, a pretty straightforward idea. TCRs, token curated registries, are a really new idea, just in the past year or so. It's a really hot topic. I want to start by emphasizing the fact that they're not proven, right? The first such system that I'm aware of is AdSense, and that went online. AdChain, and that went online just a few days ago. Is it on main? Yeah, I think it is, right? So the high-level idea here is that people are incentivized, economically incentivized, to sort of express their opinion and kind of place a bet on the future, right? So I hold a certain number of tokens, whatever that token may be, and I stake them on a particular. So basically, at the end of the day, it's a registry, it's a list, right? And so someone can apply to be added to the registry, and I think the idea is I stake my tokens when I've confused myself.
You want me to step
Go
in?
for it. It's a confusing idea.
Yeah, so essentially a TCR uses coin voting, but it's designed around a shelling point mechanism. So if you've got people voting and there's like a majority and a minority consensus on a specific issue, you are rewarding the people that ended up in the majority at the expense of either the people that are like paying a deposit to be like listed, people that proposed it, or in some cases at the expense of the minority vote. And because people don't necessarily know how other people are going to vote, it's like a commit reveal mechanism. The natural shelling point, if everybody is like not coordinating, should be to pick the thing that is the best entry. So there's like a metagame incentive for people to kind of vote in the best interest of what they truly believe, as opposed to maybe just trying to like posture or something for their own like personal gain in terms of a typical governance structure. That being said, it definitely like needs to be tested. Shelling coin mechanisms are tricky. Vitalik had a post I think in 2014 talking about the shelling coin game, which has a lot of similarity to issues that you see with TCRs. And some of the proposed ways to like make them better as we start to see how these perform is to like do delegate voting, or to do like what you were talking about, more bribery resistant voting, so you can't like bribe the people that are participating in the vote, that sort of thing.
Just to add one thing, so kind of trying to boil this down in plain English, because I think it's important to try to do that as well. Basically, it's an exciting new idea, which has enormous potential, I think, that incentivizes people not to vote, as you said, sort of selfishly for what they themselves believe or want, but rather to try to kind of predict what's best for the community. That's kind of what's supposed to come out of this, because the only way that you can vote and be rewarded is by ending up in the majority. It's a very powerful concept. It's a very powerful way to align incentives economically.
Afsa is hanging out, and he has a
Hey, Alex.
comment. On governance models, I think we should agree that we need to build these models first, and then after they're working on dApps, we can debate using it for the whole chain. In some years, we will have a reputation-based social media media, apps that use multiple governance structures, autarky, never even heard of that one. By then, it should be easier to use for a general schema. You guys have any comments on that?
That's a good idea.
Yeah, experiment first.
Yeah.
Yeah, the problem. Yeah, the problem of experimentation in governance is that, well, it's like you cannot. It's very difficult to learn play poker without having money. So
Yeah.
governance is a little bit the same. So when you want to test governance, it needs to be for real, and then it's just a matter of how much you limit on that. But for sure, governance system needs to be tested. Needs to be environments and that are difficult. It's not excuse that the governance is difficult is not an excuse to do it and to try it. So it's like I would say that's better a bad governance than no governance in my point of view. So yes, we need to test it, and we need to create these environments where we can really start testing these new ideas in governance.
Yeah, so having large number of experiments with real funds on real things, and then as John suggested, making split as cheap as possible, so as easy as possible. So with the click of a button, you can make a new governance system, maybe with no protocol, maybe with the same protocol but new distribution or whatever the voting weight are, or permutation or token, and then just letting those many experiments evolve and show, just kind of like flow and show what works and what doesn't.
To be clear, this is happening, right? So
Yeah.
the way EOS is governed is very different from the way Dfinity is governed, which is very different from Tezos and Ethereum. So I think
making
those
it
economic
stake.
experiments are happening, and there is money at stake on these chains. But I mean, yes, one of the topics that came up yesterday is how can we run more of these experiments in the Ethereum world?
Right, but also allowing to push it to the community so that
Yeah.
anyone can open a new governance system.
Yeah.
with them. So you get
On a side chain or
hundreds-
something, yeah.
Right, hundreds of governance systems.
Yes.
So one idea to that is we don't necessarily have to have a single governance system on Ethereum itself. Like we can have multiple ones, and maybe ideally you would be able to subscribe to the governance model you want to have. And if you don't want to have any, and you just want to follow the protocol rules itself, and I want my utility and that's it, then maybe that's also fine, right? So.
And that could maybe be done at layer 2. So you could
Yeah.
opt in. Your contract could subscribe to this or that mechanism.
Yeah.
Yeah, one way to think about it is in layers. If you have at the base layer something that is very limited in scope in terms of the decisions and controversial nature that you're going to make, and then in subsequent layers you have further opting into different things that you're subscribing to and different political views or different aims, you kind of sort of mitigate the fact that you've charted the community consensus to a certain degree, right? You've got at the base layer everything that we agree on, and then from there you've got things that this side of the room agrees on and this side of the room agrees on in separate little.
So that's so the base layer, the protocol is the constitution, which we
Yeah.
all follow, and then you have states or regional governments or something. You can kind of to some degree you can kind of move around. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but
Yeah.
you can opt to transact in a particular jurisdiction is what I'm saying.
So William Schwab asks, with most kind of voting, there isn't just an issue of reducing noise. There seems to be a massive potential for Sybil-like attacks. How do we know when someone has spawned an army of personas? I think in general, what do you guys think about Sybil issues?
Yeah.
It's a hard problem.
And be really loud. The speakers over, the mics over there.
Personally, I think solving the question of decentralized Sybil resistant identity, bonus points with anonymity retained is the holy grail for everything and will change the world. But it's a really, really hard problem. And so right now, you can look at these different singling mechanisms, whether it's reputation or coin voting, that provides some level of Sybil resistance to get a different signal. But it's really, really hard to measure users. The hardest thing in Ethereum governance is that we don't have a good signal for users, right? Token holders are not users. They're investors or potentially validators. Devs are not users directly. They're a subset of users. But there's no umbrella thing that's the community of people that are going to use this platform that we can objectively measure in any way. So
Right, and just to put that in context, right? If you try to look at transactions, attaching signals to transactions, you're punishing hodlers. You're punishing people who don't transact, but they're users, right? And if you instead look at coin votes, you're punishing maybe people who come into and out of Ethereum and transact but don't hold a lot of coins. That's why it's so hard.
Yeah, every signal is not quite
Right.
right, for what we really want to measure.
I think there's some really, so I agree. I mean, the Sybil issue is like this problem is one of the hardest and most valuable, important problems to solve. I just want to mention there are some creative approaches. There's some creative things that are happening. So I'll just throw out there, like Democracy Earth has a very interesting approach called proof of attention. I won't explain the details, but that's one. I think Circles UBI has an idea which is reputation based. It's like a web of trust model. I'm hopeful that like some patchwork of these ideas will work, but we're not there yet.
So reputation-based system can be pretty Sybil resistant. Going back then proof of value. So if you only get reputation based on contributions or real contributions,
Right.
it's evaluated by the existing reputation system. So by definition, it's completely insensitive for who made the contribution. If it's 10 people or 1 person, so it's pretty fairly Sybil resistant. But then of course it depends if you like the system or not.
Yeah, AnyFinny1 on the note asks, what if we base the reputation system on deployed most contracts?
So this goes back to what you were saying before, right? It's one metric. But
Yeah, it's one metric. Though one of the things we talked about as a potential signal was contract usage in terms of transaction volume. So you could place a vote, but instead of weighting the vote on like coin holdings, it's like recent transaction history for a contract. So if you're trying to measure DApp usage, like in the community, like CryptoKitties was one of the hugest dApps that was used on Ethereum. If you look at that contract and you look at the transaction volume, maybe that should have a larger weight in some of these signals if you're trying to measure
Right.
DApp usage.
Nice. Okay. I do have another one. Christopher Golly says, what if users had to register on Uport or status in order? Is that a Sybil answer?
Social identity.
Super loud.
Social identity is definitely workable. It
Yeah.
depends, but again, eventually it all boils down to the metric questions. So it depends what's your. It's not just about Sybil resistant. It matters like what's the metric that you want to measure, as being valuable. And I think that there is though such one metric, and that's why you have to allow for multiple metrics and then opt-in system as you described before.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think there are people who use Ethereum for whom pseudonymity or anonymity is really important. So I think forcing people to sort of register and reveal identity may be tricky.
Yeah. I want to give a shout out to this little tiny project that I've been supporting that's in the Giveth social coding thing called Bright ID. It's like a social graph based on kind of a web of trust reputation where you would get the metric, but you wouldn't ever have to reveal publicly to like authenticate yourself. So you could have Sybil resistance without necessarily having to reveal like your actual identity. I'm hopeful that could potentially be feasible. It's like, again, it's a hard problem. I don't know if it'll work, but I think it's worth a try.
Jesus Pizarro says, I might be mispronouncing that. Do you have a working group for voting? If yes, provide more information. I'd like to help.
I think we should. I mean, we're discussing the topic of working groups today, so thank you for that question.
I also would just say that Ethereum magicians, like the DAO Stack community, the Aragon community, we're working on this stuff. So if you want to get involved, just join these communities and speak up. Like,
We should have this kind of like a meta community where you can
Yeah.
agree discussions.
I mean, so yeah, one of the topics that we plan to discuss today is how we go forward from here. And I certainly, from my part, hope that working groups are part of it, and I hope that we have a lot of news to share on that as soon as today or tomorrow.
And we have a big conversation about voting
Yeah.
specifically too, because there's some contentious ideas on how good voting is, if it's the best governance mechanism anyway.
I just want to go back on something I said a moment ago. We want to have things to share with you, but we want it. This is again, it's an interactive process, and like don't wait for any individual or any group to sort of announce anything from on high. Like if you have ideas, let's get that conversation going in the FEM forum or Reddit or other channels, the governance Gator channel.
So Michael H. cautions, using the transaction metric would result in exchanges having too much power, wouldn't it? Should we allow organizations to have votes or just people? Are organizations people?
We need a legal.
Corporations are people.
I think that's a really good point. One of the things that I really like about the approach of using signals that are non-binding is you can aggregate these things and you can filter them. So like, if you personally like want to filter out all exchanges because there's like a TCR of exchange addresses, and you just want to like filter that out of your signal and just ignore it, that's totally like relevant. And I would even advocate that if you're like trying to measure something that like, if you can exclude data that throws off what you're trying to measure, you should always do that. But the fact that it's like non-binding means you don't need to worry as much about like any specific detail. You can be like, okay, why is this signal not working? How can I improve it? Without like even asking permission, because everybody can decide how to interpret these signals individually.
I agree with that. You give me a signal, I'll show you a way to game it or a way that it's sort of non-representative of the community at large, which is why it's so important to have so many different signals.
Yeah, and have the flexibility to change things.
Exactly.
Because like nobody's going to try and game these. Nobody's going to try as hard to
Right.
game these signals if they know that as soon as they actually succeed, they invest a bunch of money trying to game the system. You're going to look at a different signal instead. You're like, this signal's not working anymore.
Change the channel.
So you have these signals, and then you have people that are actually making the decisions. How do you what's the governance that connects the two? How do you connect the actual decision makers?
I mean, my personal opinion is decentralization only works if it's bottom up from the individual. And if you look at the true, like, the only formal governance in Ethereum right now, it's coders write the protocol, like node operators run the protocol, and users that participate in the protocol, like they buy or sell tokens to participate, right? So fundamentally, those are the only things that's static in the governance process. And each of those like decision makers that's deciding how they're going to spend their time or their resources is making that decision based on the inputs available to them. So if you improve the signal quality, then you improve the overall decision making like quality of the community.
If we have time, it might be interesting to just quickly go down the line and hear from each person here, like 10 seconds on like how do you get signals? Because I think we each have different answers.
Oh man.
30 for
So,
you, Hudson.
Yeah, because I one of my titles is community manager. So basically, Reddit, Twitter, Reddit less and less because it's getting real trolly. Twitter to an extent, Skype channels, Gitter channels, Ethereum Magicians Forum, the Ethereum Forum. Some channels with like specific like interest groups like governance and miners and things like that. Riot, Discord groups. So yeah, just kind of social media platforms in general. Alfred?
Yeah, same here. I'm basically doing community management for Parity, and I'm also on all the channels you mentioned, and that's how I gauge sentiment in first place. I have to say, surprisingly, Twitter is a very valuable resource for discussion. It's changed a lot in the recent years. And I have to agree that Reddit is a more difficult place for controversial discussions because of how the commenting and voting structure works. It often happens that controversial comments with a lot of thought get hidden, and yeah, it's a difficult topic.
A plea to everyone on Reddit that the upvote thing on comments is supposed to mean that it contributes to the conversation, not that you agree with it.
Objective, not subjective.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree, the same proliferation of channels. I would just add, as far as so that's sort of the raw input. As far as the weighting calculation, I mean, again, it's we all have a version of it and it's hard to understand, but the one thing I would share in honesty is that I'm probably weighting the input of different channels and different individuals based on the level of their technical kind of knowledge or contribution. And I get that that's not all-encompassing and not entirely fair, but as a technical person, that's sort of the filter that I naturally apply.
Yeah, for me it's mostly Reddit and Twitter, plus people who reach out individually to me. Surprising number of Twitter DMs and Reddit DMs and so on of people just saying, I thought X, Y, Z, or thanks for expressing your opinion, or, I disagree, or whatever.
Yeah, I would echo that. I feel like for me personally, I try and make an effort, at least on Twitter, to follow people that when they tweet, I'm like, I disagree with that completely. but I distinctly make an effort to do that just because I think having some mechanism to try and break yourself out of an echo chamber is really important. But trying to find the specific people that have those differing opinions that aren't just like shouting trolley stuff and repeating everything they say, because otherwise you're just like super frustrated.
I would like to add also the direct conversations. So talking directly with people that you have that have a real reputation, talking about specific topics. This is a kind of signal, and this is when you really can see, you can have more information, and you can taste the status of the community. Probably it's not the best system. I don't think it's a perfect system, but I think that direct communication and peer-to-peer communication, it's important to taste the thing.
Yeah, my favorite signal system in relation to governance, it's not yet live, but basically it's a signal system that is based on prediction. So people can put their money where their mouth is. They can predict what will be the outcome of a certain proposal. They can put a stake on it. And if they're right, they get profit. If they're wrong, their stake is slashed. And that basically, and then to your question, you can relate that signal system to the governance system and make basically only proposals that get very positive signal, only then the governance system can apply to them. And you can show that this kind of like feedback loop between the signal system and the governance system makes the governance system much more effective. Yeah, there is also a proposal by Vitalik from this year, March this year, actually, basically doing the same thing for curation. So that's my favorite.
Right. Also, for me, it's mostly the same. I will look at Twitter and Reddit to like roughly gauge what's happening. But I also think like just having random lunch conversations or like meeting with friends is not very representative, but also occasionally more sane. To see also like what they are aggregated, and then feel like their opinions, and really like an environment that's more open to things like empathy that you don't necessarily have on social media.
Yeah, James Pitts has something to say along the same lines, because a lot of us are lucky enough that we end up meeting these people in person occasionally at conferences like this and other opportunities, but not everyone has that. And so he suggests that we should have a roadshow, like an EIP in-person, EIP0 in-person roadshow, that where we go from place to place, and it might be a better way to identify the stakeholder groups and form personal relationships with people in the community too, kind of bridge that web.
Hi, Jamie. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, James, sorry.
All that one thing, which I find with calls really helpful to measure sentiment of specific groups. It's not the broad signal of the entire community.
You're talking about all core devs calls?
All core devs calls. I mean, there's more specific ones as well, like classic calls. I find they're very helpful. I find the social media channels almost too much information, and it takes too much effort to keep up to speed with, and I don't find it very helpful.
I'm not sure if the audio picked up. I'll just briefly repeat what you said. You're saying calls are often more helpful than social media. Yeah. We should be rotating in and out. I just wanted to say, I think that kudos to pointing at Griff, to Griff and the Giveth team. I think your radical transparency push and the live streaming all your calls, whether it's Giveth, whether it's the open source Block Explorer project, is enormously valuable. So we should be doing more of that for governance. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Daniel. I work with Consensus, specifically Pegasus, which is our protocol engineering group at Consensus.
Okay, so William Schwab says, this might be a bit of a subject change, but I'm really interested in what happens after the vote. As of right now, it looks like the official GitHub is the official face of what the F code is. I don't know if that's true, but
So the Ethereum GitHub is the official
face
code
of what the F code is. So, and like,
Yeah, that's a legacy thing. Back in the day, there was nothing else but the Ethereum Foundation, and actually all the clients used to be with the Ethereum Foundation. C++, Geth, Python, JavaScript, and Java were all funded or in-house for the Ethereum Foundation back in the early days. And so all the repositories were in the GitHub/Ethereum repository that's controlled by the Ethereum Foundation. Now there's clients like Parity and Elixir or Ethereum built on Elixir and others that are outside of that repository but don't necessarily get the same recognition because it doesn't have the Ethereum name in the GitHub URL. So it's not something that we can easily just like throw away that GitHub URL name to make it seem less like that's the only clients or the only implementations. So what we need to do is work harder to make sure that there's stuff like the yellow paper and the Jello paper that are updated a lot. And yeah, I think the Jello paper is basically the yellow paper, but in like human readable language.
Isn't it the mauve paper?
No, the mauve paper is something Vitalik wrote for Casper or Sharding, one of the two.
There's another one.
Yeah, there's a bunch of colored papers. There's a white paper as well. But either way, so we basically need to just make more of a push to let people know that we are a decentralized organization now, and it's not just the foundation running everything.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate. I mean, no one Ethereum implementation code base is definitive, and no one has any more legitimacy than any other. That's sort of the point of Ethereum, and we're trying to encourage more.
Well, Pegasus is writing a client, right?
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how close are you guys to?
Yeah, so I'll get absolutely shot if I try. I can tell you. Work is going well, right? Yeah, that's as much as I'm going to commit to.
Cool. Do you have any ideas on how you're going to make, as a client, yourselves, is there an idea for how you're going to make your client more popular or more well-known in the space?
So one of the reasons I was interested in attending this is we're planning to open source, as most people do, and figuring out the governance process where people can contribute, get ownership as well, and have the best ideas bubble to the surface is going to be one of the big challenges. And so, as was discussed earlier, the challenges that are reflected in the entire community also matter in sub-projects, and figuring out governance through experiments is going to be interesting. For us, in terms of how we get popularity and adoption, I guess we're trying to do a couple things. One is, we're writing the client in Java, so we're just hoping it'll appeal to people who are more comfortable working in Java, which is a different set of developers out there. Two, we're trying to, because it's in Java, define some clean interfaces that make it a little easier for people to build on top of or swap out certain components and customize the client as they want for different implementations. That's obviously a long-term vision. That's not how we're going to start out the gate. Those are some of the ideas we're working with.
Cool. Discussing Reddit's decline should be part of, this is Jared Pope, by the way.
Hi, Jared.
Yeah. Discussing Reddit's decline should be part of governance. Social norms around it have been left unattended. Any comments on that?
I think that's true. That is all. If anyone else has a comment.
I think it's also maybe up to the community to kind of self-govern itself. It's kind of like up to the community to self-govern itself when it comes to the level of discussion. And if you are a member of the community and you go to a channel and you see that the level of discussion is kind of plummeting, just maybe speak up. And one thing I know is it's actually quite taxing to be active in social media, especially when the level of discussion goes down. And it is up to the good actors to take some risk and go down there and disagree with somebody, even if it makes you uncomfortable, because otherwise we'll just get buried under the trolls.
So William Schwab asks, so to clarify, the idea is that since he was asking about the clients before, since these are clients across different groups of devs, if there's a vote on a certain issue, we assume that enough of the client devs will update according to the vote, and those who don't will be abandoned.
You have a word bite on this about how, sorry to single you out here, about how there's always been consensus among the core devs, with the one exception being the DAO. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, there's usually consensus among the core devs. I should put it this way. Whenever there's a disagreement, it's purely technical, and it's sometimes just technical to the sense of which database would you rather use? this, or like how should we implement this network layer protocol change, or things like that. What type of compression to use when you're dealing with whatever, I don't even know. A lot of highly technical stuff. So whenever that happens, there's a lot of technical arguments, but as far as philosophical arguments, we've rarely run into that, I find, because a lot of the vision is aligned and people are more heads down technical software developer types that don't want to deal in the political realm. So that's generally why we haven't run into many issues, with the exception being the DAO. But even then, a lot of the core developers at the time didn't want that responsibility, didn't want that power, and so they just kind of were put in a position as the ones who produced the clients to do things like enable or disable defaults, or stuff that was really hard decisions for them at the time. So stuff like that is when things get sticky.
As a potential counterpoint offer, am I remembering correctly, didn't you say something yesterday about the decrease in block rewards last year being a little contentious?
Yeah. Was it a question?
Was it, do you agree with what Hudson's saying, that core devs sort of always reach a consensus?
Oh yeah, right. The issue here is that the things we discuss among the core devs are only of technical nature so far. And this change of the block reward reduction was kind of necessary because we also reduced block times by delaying the ice age, and this was, nobody disagreed on a technical level in this all quarters. That's how this proposal was accepted, and now it's final because it was activated with the scientific fork. But there were people that in most cases identified themselves as miners that had
Strong reservations.
Yeah, had the need for discussions and debate beyond that technical level. We were discussing this proposal at the all quarters. We are seeing now more and more proposals that are debated on beyond the technical level, and this is something that's pretty much why we are sitting here, right? We need to figure out how to deal with this.
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean, this is happening today with 867 and 999, and that's one of the things that we're talking about is what is the right forum for discussing again, we'll use the word philosophical kind of implications. I don't know that we have an answer to that yet.
Yeah. So I think also like on the technical level, like the EIP process goes by the consensus or rough consensus of the developers. And in the technical realm, that's actually quite easy to achieve because you just present arguments for or against, and people either agree or not on. But usually, you can sway people pretty easily. Like if someone disagrees, it's usually lack of understanding, and if you explain it to them, they will get it. If the problem is like more of a political, philosophical nature, then you might have disagreements that are not possible to reconciliate so easily. And consensus might be just impossible. And what you would do in politics then is just have some sort of mechanism where a decision is reached, and as long as the decision doesn't have to be like a disagreement, but as long as everyone agrees to follow the outcome of the process and accept the results, then we are fine. So that's basically the thing we don't have yet that we want to have. Right?
So there's a lot of discussion on here about Reddit. Taylor from My Crypto is saying Jared is right. I don't think people know how to solve the Reddit problem. And Carl Larson says, could Reddit be improved, or is it a write-off? What would improve the signal from there? There are a lot of people contributing there, over 100,000 people, and it might be hard to write that off.
You had a good idea the other day.
Oh yeah, it was yesterday, right? I don't think we can fix Reddit, but there are mechanics within Reddit. For instance, I think like the huge Bitcoin subreddits are doing it, that like you can hide the comment score for a certain amount of time, and I was like trying to discuss this with the other moderators of the subreddit, if we should do steps towards such measures to improve the discussion quality on Reddit. For instance, to avoid that comments that people mainly disagree with get hidden, even though they contribute to the discussion. And yeah, if anyone has suggestions how we can improve the subreddit quality, just step up and approach your favorite Reddit moderators.
Yeah, well, we just need to put a sticky thread or something to improve it.
Yeah.
In general, whoa. If that didn't get captured on camera, we have a board that almost fell on someone. Anyways, we should do a Reddit sticky thread on this.
Yeah. Meta Reddit thread.
Meta Reddit thread.
Yeah, so Taylor says the easiest way to build a strong community of people who are like-minded, kind, thoughtful, and insightful is to build a new one. But online communities will always degrade as they grow. I would say Research is a pretty cool community that's starting to build out.
I agree, but it's also very young. I mean, that started last year. And Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians started this year.
I would make one exception. That I think like-minded is not necessarily what we want. We actually want people with different opinions that can converse like they're like-minded in that they want like a civilized conversation.
Maybe like-minded in ethics.
Yeah.
Some values there.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to throw this out there. I'm curious what people think. Like, I'm a relative outsider to Reddit, and I find Reddit kind of terrifying for that reason. Like, I want to spend more time there because it's the Wild West and there's a role for that. But like Stack Exchange, Stack Overflow seems to have gotten the reputation thing right. Why can't we do something like that? I don't know what piece is missing there, but I do think reputation is part of the answer. I mean, as far as the non-crypto world goes, they're like the exemplar. They're like the best example.
The difference is that Stack Exchange, the rules is they're question, answer, and they're technical. And when there is something that's opinion, that's political,
they just shut it down. It's true.
So I don't think it's comparable the one with the other.
Fair enough.
For that.
Well, you might need to have a multi-value reputation system to account for more dimensions in the conversation.
Yeah, we are reputation systems clearly, but we are mixing. I think we are arriving. Well, that's the solution we have. It's like signals. Signals is like the input of the process, and then is an algorithm that creates a reputation system, and of course there can be many algorithms. But that's the true, and the result of this algorithm is what the basis for the governance. And this is the technical part of what's pretty much what we're discussing.
So there's a lot of discussion here about Reddit on this chat. I don't know if I can go through it all, but I will say, Jared says, I think social norms, traditions, customs, they can all be designed or at least influenced, and it's something he's been looking into, and probably don't have the answers yet, but that might be a path to start going. And but I'm going to move off the Reddit topic because there's a good question here by Michael H. In an effort to decentralize, what can normal users do to increase useful discussion about this? How do we get users more involved in the governance process without devolving the level of discussion?
I guess the Reddit thing for me, the idea of starting new communities is essentially equivalent to basically if you're dissatisfied with the quality of discussion, you create a new community. And that's kind of the ethos of open source and open communities like this. So like seeing things like EIP0 or Ethereum Magicians emerge as like a response to the declining quality of conversation on Reddit, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And hopefully, like the people that really want to contribute will go to the communities that have the highest signal, because you're trying to, if you want to influence like people as a whole, you go to where the signals are the highest. Because if you are shouting amongst a bunch of trolls, you're not going to be heard. I don't necessarily see that as a huge problem.
I think this touches upon something we discussed in the beginning, which is understanding and documenting. I think that if we, and this is on us, right, those of us who are participating in this process today, if we make the effort to understand and hopefully document it in an accessible way, hopefully that will help enfranchise more people and bring them into the conversation.
It's been about an hour. Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, let's rotate. I want to offer my seat to.
Everyone runs in. Get in there. I need more coffee.
I'm serious. Yeah, we gotta get Dan up there. Anyone else want to join the AMA?
Give me a hug. We're doing hugs.
What?
Yeah, I mean, it's
Holding it down.
busy.
Okay. Okay, cool. So let's see what else we got. Well, how about new people introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Jorge from the Aragon team.
Hi, I'm Dan from the MetaMask team.
Okay, I'm Luis from Aragon. I'm Josh from the Web3 Foundation.
I'm Hudson again.
So maybe we can start off just again, what do you guys think is the most urgent need for governance in Ethereum? Like what do we need to change, or what low-hanging fruit, urgency? What are your thoughts on governance in Ethereum?
I think the most urgent thing is even the people that are here, we're not really clear on what's the way to pass some controversial issues, who gets to make the final decision, and that's a good thing. But I imagine that if there's confusion here, we're really struggling to define what community is. It's even harder for people outside of the circle to see what's going on and what could happen.
Yeah, kind of harkening back to the last discussion, I think visibility into the community sentiments, and obviously there's a reputational component, and finding out what that means and how we want to get our view into the ecosystem, I think would be the strongest tool maybe for getting on the same page, because a lot of the arguments I see, especially when we're talking about anti-hard fork, is because people don't want a contentious hard fork, right? Like I really like Alex Vandesand's points about let's look at smart contracts with complicated conditions like the DAI stablecoin system, and how would they handle the fork? Which of their coins is legitimate, and all this. And I think if we had strong signals that let everybody know at what point sentiment was strongly in one favor or another, then that would inform us better. But yeah, it's just about getting on the same page, right? Because everyone can upgrade their clients as they like. That's my take.
Well, I don't know. Maybe one thing I can just reiterate is that this is not the Ethereum governance. We are not the government.
Thank God.
We are just we are just people who came here to talk about trying to figure out the problem, or maybe get some pointers on directions where the discussion should go to. But we are not decision makers, and we are not going to break immutability tomorrow or anything like that.
I think also we are developers here, and developers, we hate to document stuff, but it's so necessary right now. I think it's super easy to use document all the processes that we have, and that creates a lot of accountability, creates transparency. It is not hard to do. It is boring, and we as developers don't like to do that, but we should, because the community is whatever the community means. They need this transparency, this accountability, and as you guys were talking about, they need to have some certainty of what happens if some critical scenario is reached. And that's why documentation comes in, knowledge comes in, and if it's written in a format that anyone can just go and check it out, it's very powerful.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that we covered yesterday was our inability to define who the community actually are and whether they have common interests. And I think it's fair to say that different subsets of the community will have different interests. So the mining community might have different interests from the investor community, from the community of core developers, from the community of dApp developers. And I think it could be an interesting idea to have little subsets of the community, even individuals who take the lead on trying to identify sentiment within their own subset of the community. Because at the moment we're getting confusing messages from different parts of the community. So I don't know what that would look like. As a more general point, I think some kind of constitution, or even just a kind of list of some of the values that we as a group stand for would be helpful in articulating and informing some of the decisions that we try to make on governance going forward.
You got anything to add?
I was just thinking about the Constitution idea once you said it, and I've only thought about it for about 45 seconds, but I think it's a really good idea, and I was just brainstorming all the ways we could communicate it to people. So coming up with some kind of like list for Reddit and Twitter, and just like coming up with a draft in Google Docs and literally opening it up to the world to be like, hey, come in here and put comments on, until it gets too trolly, and then we'll have to shut it down. But at least initially there'll be some good thoughts of like, what are the core values? What is the mission of Ethereum? What are we trying to get to in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? That kind of stuff is like missing from a lot of organizations, and also from Ethereum in general.
Yeah, shameless plug. Giveth is actually doing that right now.
Yeah, nice.
We have a competition, because Giveth is a community. We're not really a company or anything like that. So we actually have, we need to write a manifesto and what we say and articulate it clearly. So we have a little competition where the best manifesto gets 1 Ether, and the second best gets 0.4, and the third one gets 0.2, and it's open to everybody, you know. And I think that would be along the same lines of Ethereum too, right?
Yeah.
What you're saying.
There's also like maybe a problem, and the problem that's like apparent in like EIP0, or which states that, you know, the Ethereum philosophy is mentioned without actually defining what it is. And also like yesterday when we were trying to figure out what the community is, like we were trying to figure out, can we like even point out like a single principle of, if you're a member of the Ethereum community, you adhere to this principle, and it's actually quite hard to figure out what that should be.
There's this awesome book called Reinventing Organizations that they do a survey of 47 different companies that have flat hierarchies, and they mention most of these groups do have a manifesto or a constitution, but a lot of them, a few of them actually decided against that because it pigeonholes you to a certain thing that becomes hard to change. And so there is, while I think there's value on having it, at the same time we should recognize that there is value in having it be verbal and be something that can change easier in that sense.
We also did this exercise in Aragon in our last when we were designing our network, like this set of values, an ordered list of values of what the network stands for. And I think that's number one. I don't want to be a pessimist. I don't think it's possible for the community to kind of shell into just one list of ordered values. Like even just the ordering is very difficult. But I think it's absolutely necessary. And then when you're making a decision, like it's actually easier if you can go and see what the priority of the values are, or if it's even like a value there. And if when adding a value, it needs to like respect all the other values. We tried doing this, and it's a very useful exercise. I don't know if you can do it with a community of 10 million token holders or like different groups that are involved in Ethereum right now. But I would love to see this.
Also, Ethereum is supposed to be like super neutral by itself because it's basically a year for developers to build upon. So it should be like super neutral kind of thing. Like just we were talking yesterday, like what is the thing that everyone agrees on in Ethereum? And basically it's that they're like the blockchain needs to continue. There need to be like new blocks. That's something that we can all agree about. But I'm not sure if we can get into like the more political aspects, because then as I think look, I said this some days ago, like you can build democracy and anarchy, but you cannot build anarchy and democracy. And we should have, like Ethereum should be super unopinionated about the things that you can build on top of it.
Yeah.
So changing the topic a little bit. Where is it? Josh Wyszynski, butchered his name. My general opinion is that problems like EIP99 should be solved on the lower layers, like an ERC20 contract or something with reversibility. Ethereum should be a neutral layer. Ethereum should only require technical trade-offs, and devs should not need to be involved. Any opinions on that, guys?
Hindsight. Yeah. Great idea. Time machine. Now all we need is a time machine, and that'll be perfect.
At this point, it's almost impossible because the devs actually code the protocols. So like excluding developers, but saying there needs to be development style layers or developer layers that are only built by developers seems, counterintuitive.
I think like ideally, the governance will be like built on top of the platform, and it will be like layer 2 stuff. Maybe the layer 2 would require some sort of extra opcodes in EVM or something for specific use cases, and require some signaling, which if you deploy a contract, your contract would have to subscribe to one or the other. But I'm not sure if we can like exclude the lower levels from being completely influenced, because in the end, like, what if you build a level 2 governance system and you have a bug in that, right?
Hard form. No. So let's see. So James Pitts says, what we may need now is more formal processes, clearer lines of participation, more structure to communicate and govern. And then Taylor says, in line with that, I think having softer documentation on expectations on how people should communicate would be really helpful. I always come back to this great guide on GitHub, and she posts a link to it. And it's like how to write the perfect pull request. And they say, be humble, avoid hyperbole, be aware of negative bias with online communication, use positive language, and communicating that beforehand would be helpful. Any comments?
That sounds great. I'm going to add that to my pull request contributing guide and be grateful when people follow it. But yeah, like you're always going to have the fringe people who don't follow that stuff. So I think part of the fun of the blockchain is that we prepare for the worst case also. You know, like it's great to embody the best case that we can, but yeah, there's going to be trolls. We need some way of making sure we're filtering the ideas that are influencing us and our client and its fork choice rule.
I think there's a shift between how we used to kind of feel like everyone should do their own thing, we're shaping ourselves, we're still figuring out who we are, and now it's becoming more and more clear that we need more guides. So like, how to be a good Ethereum, if that's actually the term we're using to describe ourselves, or like how to participate in the governance process effectively, and things like that. It's no longer the case that we need time to, kind of cumulatively get everybody together and have everyone have their own ideas. I think it's going to start to form more into formalized processes. Not to say that people shouldn't be able to do what they want, it's just more things are shifting to where some of the thought leaders are going to start writing stuff down that people will probably follow. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Let's see, so we have James Pitts says, one question I have is how to handle divisive issues, possibility of minority opinions or objections without blocking consensus, so that those who disagree can feel that the process worked. How do you deal with the people that are disenfranchised by decisions?
Yes, so I guess that falls against this idea of legitimacy. It's like there are like two kind of levels on which you can disagree. You can go like, I disagree, but I will go with whatever decision has been reached, or I disagree, and if the outcome is one I don't like, I will fork, right? So we kind of want to find out this like first group and try to accommodate that kind of conflict resolution where we still kind of continue on the same path, and anyone who disagrees can actually see that the process has been fair. My voice has been heard. People just didn't agree. Tough luck. Moving on, right? I guess that's roughly it.
I actually think that now, with the lack of any sort of formal process, I would argue that minorities are very well represented, because basically it's a problem that also democracies have. Like you have a lot of small minorities that have a lot of voice and are capable of creating a lot of noise, and so to amplify their concerns. So I would say that right now, without having a formal process like coin signaling or anything like that, we're actually optimizing for minorities, which I don't know if it's a right thing either, but it's just like I think the way it is right now.
Well, on like very political level, like I think like in democracy is also like a responsibility of the majority to try to represent the issues of minority if they can. So if there is a vote about let's say gay marriage, most people aren't gay, but they will still vote one way or the other, right? And it's like the majority, if the issue at hand doesn't necessarily present you, maybe you should still like vote and have a voice, represent the minority in the way you think is appropriate.
Yeah, no, if you have like a core set of values or like a manifesto, something like that, then it should be your duty as part of the community, whatever there is, to actually check them out and vote whatever your interpretation of those values is.
Wouldn't coming up with that constitution be about as hard as deciding on a hard fork? Like how do we know when that's legitimate, right, and representing the consensus of the community?
Ideally, what you do is when you start a project, you start with that list of values or the manifesto. Doing that right now after everything's been live for a couple of years or it's gonna be tricky. Yeah.
Well, I think maybe if we like have a constitution of some kind by a miracle, and that leads to a fork of some kind, then that might be the lesser evil than just having a fork every time there is a disagreement. You just like do it once, and then at least we'll have this one track on which we can like continue on.
Would the Constitution really prevent forks, or would it just be like a guiding light that the discussion was somewhat framed under?
It should at least minimize it, right? It should at least minimize the chance of it.
Yeah, I think one of the first points that the Constitution should say is like, I mean, of course, forks are super important, and if you feel like you can always be able to fork off is super important, but I think one of the points should be like, do we want to minimize forks, community splits, or is this something that isn't done? And this is like a complicated trade-off, because if we say, okay, we minimize forks, then you could start having pressure groups that start trying to pass outrageous stuff because like a fork will be avoided. So I think that's, for me, that's the main issue. Like actually to Griff's question before, I think the main issue would be figuring out whether we want to like avoid forks, at what cost do we want to avoid forks. Because like me personally, and like thinking about Aragon, I'm freaking out at like the mere possibility of a fork being like of any kind. It's horrible. It's like, do you like need to
Casper?
No, but that's not a community. I mean, I don't care about a like an economic fork, but a community split. That's what it's complicated, because like if we decide on one fork, but all the applications that we like to use decide on the other fork, and then they stop, like you lose a lot of network effect, and then like there's some applications that they cannot exist in two entities and in two blockchains at the same time. If you have a DAO linked to a legal entity, like you need to, I mean, someone needs to decide. There needs to be a process that says, okay, this is the real, and that can be something as easy as whatever the chain the Ethereum Foundation says is the chain, that's the real chain. But yeah.
So I think one point here is that the community split, or like this, the fork doesn't necessarily happen on like one level. That's like one thing that came up in the discussion about minimizing like the cost of a hard fork is like, it's entirely possible for node operators to favor one fork by majority, and then like dApp developers actually favor the other one, right? And so like there are like asymmetries at like multiple levels. Well, you know, maybe users choose one, dApp developers choose another, node operators choose another, in different proportions. So it's not so clean cut what the fork actually is.
So I have another good question actually from Lane, who's right over there. Does anyone on the panel have thoughts on Ethereum philosophy? If not, should we drop this idea entirely? And James Pitts adds, yes, I want to hear from each philosophical elevator pitch for Ethereum philosophy. Is it a good concept? What is it? Afri, want to start? Ethereum philosophy.
Thank you for this question. Yes, yes it is.
Yes.
There you
I
go.
subscribe to this.
Yes.
Wow.
I think,
3 yeses.
I think the Ethereum philosophy, having an Ethereum philosophy is a good idea. I'm trying to think.
I don't have the answers for it right now, but I think it's something that if, you know, while we're here today or at a later date, we could get around a table and in a room and brainstorm, the philosophical elements that we don't often talk about those things. So yeah, I think that's a good suggestion.
Were you asking about the group or philosophy? Like,
so my question is, the context here is that this is part of the EIP1 today, right? There's something in there, you might know about this, that says that like requests that are not in line with the quote Ethereum philosophy may not be discussed, or something on that.
So here's the funny thing about that. There's been a lot of talk about the Ethereum philosophy because it is listed as an EIP1, as Wayne said. Here's the problem. EIP1 was a copy-paste of the Bitcoin improvement proposals, which is a copy-paste of the Python improvement proposals, and all Martin Beasy did was change out the word Bitcoin with Ethereum when he copy pasted. So there was not thought put into the words Ethereum philosophy at the time. And then when I redid EIP1, I also just went over it. I didn't even really think deeply about it. So the origins of Ethereum philosophy are non-existent and therefore should not be taken too seriously. But if we want to create one now, I think it's a good idea. But don't ever put EIP1 in the same conversation as that, because it was literally a copy-paste, guys.
Are you entirely sure, Hudson, because there are versions of the Ethereum white paper that actually contained a chapter on Ethereum philosophy?
Yes, the white paper does. Now, I should say EIP1, don't base it on EIP1. You can base it on the white paper because it does mention it in the white paper.
Do you know what it says?
I could look it up, but not right now. Yeah, it's like 5 cornerstones of Ethereum philosophy. Shall I look it up?
Yeah. I have it here.
I'm looking it up right now.
We got
If you're going back to like the source of the copy paste, like the Zen of Python is actually quite nice.
The one in Python's not, yeah.
So, the 5 points are simplicity, universality, modularity, agility, and non-discrimination and non-censorship. And then it goes on everything.
That's a good start.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I was going to take a shot just by like measuring the actions, like because I think that Ethereum's and all blockchains' legitimacy comes from the bottom up, right? Every user who runs a client, they're participating in the network. It doesn't even have to be a full node. Hashtag controversy. But by participating, right, you're part of this community, and really it's about having a tool for building consensus in that community. And the thing Ethereum added was, the universality. I think the bullet point, right, adding a virtual machine, right, so we can do whatever we want with that consensus. But the fact the power is derived from the bottom up. So I don't think, that's why I'm not a huge fan of the constitution idea. I'm like, look, everybody's in this for their own reason. Everybody's running their node for their own reason. You don't need a singular thing as long as you can come to a single agreement together, and that's the latest block hash.
Do you have anything?
No.
I think an important question is like how do you decide what rules are used to create the block? So and how do you decide what those rules are? So there has to be like a shared values, at least among the people that are forming the blocks.
Definitely be loud.
Okay.
Should pull this forward. Don't touch those.
I don't think we want to.
That'll hurt it.
It's taped also. So like there has to be at least shared values among the people that are building blocks. But of course they're running software that's also developed perhaps by different people, like different clients. So those people also have to have a shared kind of set of values. And so like what is that? What is that kind of like shared set of values at that very base layer of like just what are the rules that we're using to build and validate blocks? The concepts that like Jorge mentioned from the white paper and you just kind of mentioned, I think are like high level concepts that a lot of people can agree with, but once you start digging into the details of like how do you actually accomplish those things, it's like is EIP 99999 consistent with that? Is the DAO fork consistent with that? Like is reducing inflation consistent with that? So like all of these controversial proposals, like you can kind of go one way or the other. If you have an objective function or like a shared like value where you can objectively kind of say in a debate, like look clearly like this logically is or is not consistent with this value or this goal, then it kind of like makes the debate a bit easier, I think.
I think the other thing to say is that the white paper was written 5 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. I don't think anybody could have predicted what has happened, and it's totally within the community's interest to iterate on what was proposed in the white paper. Companies do often iterate over half a decade what their values and philosophy and where we want to be in 5 years' time type statements. And we can use what was in the white paper as a starting point, but I think it's in our interest to be a bit more granular with our, because those are quite high level concepts. So that would be one suggestion.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Also, to be fair, I don't know if this answers Lane's question at all. This is this design philosophy of the protocols. This is like more technical. How is the protocol architected and designed more than what's the philosophy of the community or something more. Yeah. So maybe we don't have the philosophy.
Yeah.
Right. Well, everybody gets to implement their own philosophy, right? Like I tend to look at it from a user perspective, and I just tend to look like, would I set the flag or not? Which I know is very selfish because the client devs, I actually do a lot of work when there's a fork. Yeah, so I don't want to sell myself short, but like whether or not you do it. So you were asking like, is the EIP 99 in the spirit of that? Like, well, what was our original consensus? It was to install this client and basically defer our consensus decision to it, right? And so it's kind of a benevolent dictator in a way, right? So now is this new hard fork idea like consistent with that? Well, it is like every individual person's participation in the network. Like, I don't think it is a singular thing, right? It's just like the means by which we come to agree, and that involves everybody agreeing. A Grandpa Simpson quote comes to mind. I used to be with it, and then they changed what it was, and now I don't know what it is. It's like an outdated client is like somebody who just doesn't stay with what everybody else agrees with. Being stubborn about like what's the notion, what ought to be cool and right and just.
Yeah, I think the important point is like what are the rules, but also like what are the rules under which the rules can be changed, roughly, like the meta consensus. Because I think what are the rules of the protocol is kind of easy because we have it in the yellow paper and the code, but like altering that and altering that in a way that doesn't alienate people is the difficult part, right?
So to change it up, we have this question was kind of already asked, but I think it'll just generate some discussion. So rough thoughts on a voting system for Ethereum. Vote is divided into thirds: coin vote, dev vote, user vote. Exchanges are not allowed to vote. In the unlikely event of a tie, Vitalik is the tiebreaker. So there is that 1%, we discovered what it was. And the question is, so then when we break it down, coin voting shouldn't be difficult to implement, although there's questions there. Who is an Ethereum developer? This would have to be centralized, unfortunately. And then users would have to register on UPort status. So what do you guys think about that idea?
Well, the first question is like, why shouldn't exchanges be able to vote? Like they are part of the community, as far as I can tell. Like maybe if you have like the arbitrary alignment of like how many votes who gets what piece of the pie, but like I don't see why they should be completely shut off. Like their business is built on top of that. They have some interest in it. Why not? So that's my thing. And then the hardest part of that's like trifecta of users, devs. What is the third one?
Well, so there's coin voting's easy, centralizing.
Coin vote, yeah, okay. So the hardest part of that is like the users, right? Because you can do some centralized and not centralized identity systems, but then you run into the problems of again who certifies the people. Maybe some people want to be anonymous and so on, and then maybe the reputation system. So like the users part of the pie is actually the one that's actually the most difficult to map.
In particular, the users we don't have yet are like impossible to chart, and those are the ones I would argue that have the most value that is not yet represented in the ecosystem. So any coin voting, any like centralized allocation of voting credit does not necessarily account for that. And so that's why I'm like, I want to diligently defend the bottom up, the legitimacy coming from the ground, from people that aren't necessarily in the community yet. Because that's what we're making, right?
One thing that I would say about voting as a governance mechanism in Ethereum in general is that I don't like, regardless of what we kind of use to get signals, I don't think they should be prescriptive. That devs and they can't be, really. Like there's no, contract between these signals or the signal makers and developers. Developers are going to do what they want. And obviously, like, I shouldn't say obviously, but like, from what I can tell talking to developers, they're going to try to represent users' interests, and users being a very broad term here, as well as possible. But also, I think we should not try to subvert the autonomy of developers. To make decisions that they think is best for the protocol. Like we can't have mob rule one way or another over, or rule designed by committee of 1 billion people of this highly technical protocol. So that's kind of my thoughts on voting in general. In terms of that specific makeup as a kind of signaling basket, if you will, I would agree it's missing exchanges. I didn't hear anything about miners, so it's there's a whole bunch of stakeholders that weren't represented in that mix that they gave. So
I kind of like the idea. I wouldn't necessarily split it as suggested, but I think you could, as an exercise we did yesterday, divide up the community into different subsets of stakeholders, and each one would have a weighting within the vote, and each one would have their own voice, and they would congregate together to cast their vote. So you may be able to your point, John, give the development community a slightly more influence in the vote than, I don't know, people who, perhaps think we had governments and universities and regulators in there as well. These are all part of the community, and you're right, they may not be able to make some of the more technical decisions, but some of the more contentious and philosophical decisions, or that require going against, or rather get to the bottom of, confront what are the underlying philosophy of Ethereum, they might be useful in that regard.
Absolutely, yeah. So to elaborate on my previous point, riffing off of that, like voting is an interesting signal. All of the different kinds of voting that has been discussed so far, but it's not a contract. It's not like voting in a governmental system where, like, if the institution doesn't follow the vote, there's going to be a war or something, right? Like it's like it should always be accepted as a signal that the developers could use to make their decisions, but people shouldn't have like super strong expectations that developers are always going to follow those signals.
Yeah.
Like people should always be respectful of the developers' autonomy to make what they think is the best decision.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, that just to clarify. Yeah. Thank you.
Trenton Van Epps says, the SEC should get another third. I agree with that. And actually, AFSA has, along the same lines, is more about signaling than voting, and I think that's a really important thing. It's probably really hard to ever come to some conclusion of, oh yeah, this is the vote, and these are the percentages, these are the weights. But if we follow Dan's bottom-up opinion or thoughts, then if we have the signals and everyone can create their own weighting for what they think about, and they can make their decisions off of that, that's probably a more important piece. But it is all about signaling and gathering that data.
Yeah. Now, one important thing, and I don't want to misunderstand, so perhaps we can draw this out. So are you familiar at all with like what Bitcoin Unlimited was trying to do with this emergent consensus phenomenon? So like their idea was that like clients would basically set the kind of parameters, that like block size and some other parameters, and there would be like an emergent consensus formed among miners and clients. But some analysis was showing that it could lead not only to centralization because miners could game it to push the block size up, but it could also lead to a lot of splits, because if everybody's kind of setting different parameters, then there could be forks going in a bunch of different directions. Is that kind of what you were talking, or a little bit
I'm not
different?
really familiar with Bitcoin Unlimited. I'm playing a little bit with, I'm like obsessed with like designated transitive trust right now. But
Okay,
so in some ways I'm maybe borrowing a little bit from like a Stellar, like a liquid Paxos type. So let's imagine we could layer this on top of a client. You could just say like, I wrap my Geth client with a fork choice rule that just says like, well, first I can set my fork flags however I want. But if I don't really know, I can just be like, look, whatever Vitalik's into, I'll just defer to him. And then I'll just take whatever fork choice rule on the update that he takes. Or I could split it up and I could go for 60-40 and I could be like, and to avoid forks, you would just need people to have really high thresholds. You'd be like, look, I want 99% consensus of the people that I'm kind of listening to before I follow a fork without knowing what I'm doing, right? And I think the vast majority of people don't want to, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't want to know what they're talking about. Not everybody can deeply understand these problems, you know? I mean, up here, you know, I don't feel like I know every EIP we're even talking about, you know? Like, so being able to designate, delegate, I mean, that's like a fun thing to play with. And you could layer that. That's a layer 2 solution, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know if that lines up with Bitcoin Unlimited and how that sounds more like a miner signaling thing, and that sounds a little cartelish, right? 'Cause if it's a miner, it's like...
Well, it's a full nodes setting, so like like miners run full nodes, but also like individual full nodes could basically kind of set their block size limit and things like that.
Yeah, maybe they've already thought through this and there's problems with it.
The idea also kind of sounds like Definity's like blockchain nervous system. So I think their idea is that like you have basically edge consensus where like all of the nodes kind of set their as you would say like trust lines or delegation to like what rules or changes they want to make. Like, and they could always revoke their delegations if they want to and just kind of set their flags themselves. But the difference is that like the protocol automatically kind of like incorporates these things and updates accordingly, whereas we're not talking about on-chain governance necessarily.
Right. Well, because we don't have it yet. Right. Like that would be a hard fork itself. Yeah.
One thing that's weird in Ethereum is that from the beginning, miners were kind of seen as a necessary evil, I would say, and that puts it in a perspective. And I think we've seen as Ethereum has evolved, like the reduction of mining rewards and just the bomb in general, right? That incentivizes proof of stake to happen and can force miners into making decisions like reducing the mining rewards. It kind of puts miners in a disenfranchised state in Ethereum. And I don't know, I'm just curious about your guys' comments on it.
I think that the weighting that person gave earlier could be an indication of that, because miners were totally absent from it. So it's like I think there are a lot of people who in the Ethereum world that just don't even necessarily consider what miners think or care, because they're like, I'm moving to proof of stake anyway. Like, you know, I don't know. It just seems to be a common perception.
One caveat to that, even if we switch to POS, we'll have, instead of miners, we'll have like staking whales, right? We'll have exactly the same problem with not the same group of people, but maybe a different group of people, but who kind of have a different kind of set maybe of interests than everyone else.
Real quick, how are you doing on time?
We have 8 minutes. Anyone else got a comment on miners?
They are a weird class in the ecosystem, because like they have the duty of running the whole thing, but at the same time, yeah, like we're constantly trying to economically crush them. They were like the first thing we were trying to disintermediate, right? Is we're like, okay, we just need one computer we can trust. What's the least we can pay for that in a way? And so yeah, the ecosystem wants to pay the least possible for consensus, but we want strong, insurance guarantees and security. So there's a tension, absolutely. Yeah, and one of the nice things though is, since they're the ones running the consensus, if you were doing this coin vote thing, would you need them represented? I mean, they could just not take on the fork, right? They kind of have like final, like, we're not even going to validate it, say, if they really, really opposed. Or
Yeah.
maybe people would just start validating it.
They kind of do, but at the same time, if it looks like a lot of coins are voting for something that miners are against, like, miners basically have to make a decision, like, are we going to risk crashing the price of Ether and like halving our revenues? And so, I think miners as a stakeholder that's listening to these signals are paying attention to certainly the economic nodes, and including the coins, the exchanges, and like seeing where the economic activity is going to go, because if they don't follow the economic activity, then their revenues collapse. Just a thought.
Right. We can kind of bully them around. Is that what you're saying? Right.
That is what I'm saying.
Right.
And this is kind of what happened in Bitcoin. So like, last year there was this like SegWit 2x thing, which had 80% of the hash power backing it, and they called it off because large influential investors, exchanges, and other economic nodes were just like, we're not going to run this software. Like, it's just not going to happen. And sure enough, like the miners totally switched. They totally flipped, and SegWit 2x died. So, like we've seen it happen in practice that coin holders and economic nodes have more power than miners.
Yeah, and that was because the devs really didn't make SegWit 2x safe. There were like 3 devs working on it, and it wasn't battle tested enough to really happen.
That was another thing, and I think that was part of the reason why coin holders didn't have any confidence in it, is because there was not a lot of great dev support. But there is a kind of dependency chain to this thing, or like interrelated relationships where like coin holders and economic nodes need confidence in the devs, the miners need confidence in the devs, coin holders need confidence in the miners. So there's all these like interrelated relationships, but ultimately it's like the power of the purse, right? He who has the gold makes the rules.
So this is the last question. AFSA had some really great comments in here about signaling and stuff. I'm sorry, AFSA, I'm just gonna have to let it go. But William Schwab on this point said, what if miners are against the switch to POS? I mean, obviously they would be, right? Since they're not part of the long-term plan. And the client devs just need to try to stay cool as in follow public opinion as they see it. Like, I think just in general, this idea that, hey, eventually we're going to switch to POS, isn't that going to create a fork? Aren't the miners, especially if we have this ASIC miners that are popping up, then kind of like what happened with Monero when they hard forked away from ASICs, there's 6 Moneros or 5 different Moneros, 2 Monero classics, right? So like there's this will create a fork. What do you guys think about that?
I have like one idea. It doesn't apply to us ASICs, but like if you're mining on GPU, maybe you can, instead of mining, you can switch to something like Golem and rent your GPU power to actually compute something useful instead. That would be something.
I also think that like you look at what differentiates Ethereum and gives it value. I don't think, I mean, obviously like having miners and just having like an immutable chain in which you kind of double spend and all of that, that's important for a blockchain. But that's being sort of commoditized. So if you look at the added value really in Ethereum is the community. And the community doesn't really go along with the miners. The miners are sort of mercenaries right now. So I don't think it would really matter.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need the miners to hard fork to POS. It's kind of like this should be an obvious statement. But in terms of what they do afterwards, it's kind of like, well, POS has been part of the plan from the beginning, so you knew this was a temporary situation. Like if you overinvested in GPUs, like from what I hear, like gamers are really like hurting for GPU cards right now. So like I'm sure they would appreciate some cheap graphics cards. There's Zcash. And to the question of the fork, like there's already a fork. Go mine Ethereum Classic if you really want to mine a GPU or ETH hash ASIC friendly chain. But yeah, so like I mean, yeah, that's it.
I think they will mine that chain, the fork, until it stops being profitable, and then they will go do another fun thing.
Yeah, but I don't think the community will follow them, so they're going to be mining a chain that no one's using. So they should try to mine a chain that people are using, like I said, like Zcash or Ethereum Classic, if people actually use that.
Yeah, but it can be profitable for a bit. I mean, exchanges are certainly incentivized to like create this kind of like, oh my God, POS is not gonna work, and then do a fork, and then have like all the like because like
trade volume.
Yeah, trade volume and then miners like when change fork like historically in these forks like the value of the two forks has been greater than the original value, at least for like the immediate moment. So that I mean this is. Unless, like, if the community has decided what it's gonna do, and then miners and exchanges are having fun and making money on their thing, I think it's probably hard to avoid, but I don't see it as a problem.
Yeah, I like the idea of the golem though, like repurposing it for other productive uses, but still in the ecosystem. So like that would be, I don't know if we need like giant warehouses full of graphics cards for golem, but maybe someday. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah. Good questions, everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you,
that was great.
Reddit.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Okay, see you guys. Time for that.
Break for lunch. Right over there, guys.
Oh, lunch? That sounds great.
Wow.
Themselves. We want the reflections to be under Chatham House rules. So you can review what happened. Just please don't attribute anything to any individuals. Yes. So we're gonna live stream this. Scheduled to go nowish. Sure. Thanks for the reminder. On point with that. Yeah, please gather around the circle. Into the circle. Join the group, please. So are we ready with the live stream? Yes. Is it live? We are live. Hello, Internet. And welcome to the end of day 2, the last day of EIP0 Summit. We had 3 sessions today. One of those was on voting. The other one was on documenting governance. No one went to that, so we don't have to talk about that. And then the other one was, right, so since no one went to it, that one doesn't really count, but the other one that people did go to was talking about the continuation of this concept. So the EIP0 concept, for those who are just tuning in, this is an informal gathering of just people who happen to know each other in the Ethereum ecosystem who have concerns about the philosophy of Ethereum governance. And to be clear, we would love to see this conversation continue at other events as well as online, and in any venue in which 2 people who have an interest in Ethereum governance want to talk about these things, and hopefully their thoughts and findings and questions and issues will be shared out with the wider internet, as we'll do with a lot of the notes and other outcomes that were created here at this event. And then the final discussion that we just wrapped up was around funds recovery. So with that said, I would like to ask whoever was the note taker from the voting session to please come to the front and give a quick 5-minute summary of that session. And if the note taker isn't here, the note taker is here. If the note taker for the next ones aren't here, then we'll just have someone who is there. Please stand up. But Griff, I'll give the floor to you.
So voting is a very complex topic. Just even defining voting was
reputation systems would be really useful, but they're very difficult because reputation is relative, whereas votes are global. And so, again, we get into these identity issues around voting. But we have some like things that are cool, like we have attestations, like a DEFCON 2 token that Piper did. And then, so we talked about that for a little bit, right? Then we have token curated registries for attestations, which would be really interesting, but then that has drawbacks about keeping up trust. Reputation is contextual, and so dealing with that. But let's see. So the biggest thing is like when you give voting power, when you actually design a voting system, who actually has the power to vote? And distributing that fairly is really difficult. And then if you do distribute that fairly, will it lead to an optimal decision? And this is this is a debate, and it's difficult to design a voting system correctly. So there was the big issue with stake. There was a great analogy that someone made about Burning Man. And if you want to get into Burning Man tickets, then you have to remember that the sale is like 4 months, 5 months before the burn, 6 months before the burn. And so the people who are really into Burning Man, they're going to get there, they're going to be on time, and they're going to actually register for the sale, and they likely have more stake. So, yeah, the biggest thing is that there's legitimacy behind the vote, and that the group that is voting what a really good sign that a vote is legitimate is if the people that lose still follow the vote and still have stake in the result. So let's see. Yeah, I think that's probably good. There was some cool stuff, but we did get into some specific things about Ethereum near the end, about like what would be the shared assets of Ethereum that we need to be concerned. But in the end, the foundation holds a lot of those assets, and so this became more of a legal structure issue than anything. So voting wasn't really applied. But Argon is going to test this. I don't know if I can say Argon, but because they're going to so they're going to actually beta test that, where they're considering turning a Swiss foundation into a DAO and building that stepwise system. So maybe we'll have some experiments there. Cool. Great. Thanks a lot.
So for the next one, I would like to invite Reese. You're taking notes for the fund recovery one. If you would like to give not for fund recovery. Yeah. We'll do that one. We'll do that one last.
Okay. That sounds fine. You can stand. Hello, everybody on the internet and everybody in person. When I took these notes, hey, we have a lot of risk, and every time you're coding, we try to feel empathy with each other and say, man, this is really intense. There's a lot of money on the line. I want to make sure that, we've all written bugs. We want to empathize with the other people who have written bugs. The other, and the high-level macro theme of this little summit is this question of governance and how to do governance. And a big thing that's kind of come up is values and prioritizing our values and saying, hey, if we want to make a governance process, or A, we want to make a governance process at the protocol layer. If you want to make a governance process at the protocol layer, how does that happen? What does that process look like? Is it, and does that come from a foundation of values at its heart? We talked about that. We talked a little bit about some specific kind of technical things that we could do here, like insurance contracts or creating tokens that represent the lost ether. We talked about some of the incentives around that and how maybe instead of just having 50 to 100 people with lost funds, then we'll maybe have thousands of people that have incentives to fork in the future. So we talked about that. We also talked about variations on like ETH as like who's going to be holding things. Is it going to be ETH or stable coins? Then we talked about a little bit about property rights and how this should be related to property rights, both from a jurisdictional regulatory perspective and from a trying to think of, hey, if I had my car, what happens if I lose my car perspective. We looked at similar industries. We talked about other kind of platforms that are implementing governance and how they are implementing governance and all the questions in there. So we did that. Let's check final things here. We talked about immutability, social scalability. I think that the key thing that we kind of came to at the end was talking about and kind of combined the empathy piece plus the kind of legitimacy of the governance process piece, which is, hey, if I'm running this on my own computer, what would I want to do and what would I want to have happen? And if there's a process through which we want to achieve some kind of outcome, how do we make sure that we ourselves feel good about that, and how do we make sure that the outside world feels good about the legitimacy of that process? And then finally, we talked about our own bias, many of our own
that's just for the folks at home who are wondering, perhaps, FEM talks about governance, we're talking about governance, how are these conversations different? FEM is technical, we're more like philosophical. So wet code versus dry code, to use Nick Szavo's terms. Another thing that we kind of discussed was, do we institutionalize this EIP0 thing, like build a brand around it, or do we make it really more decentralized? Of course, as I said at the beginning of the live stream here, we invite everybody to have conversations around Ethereum governance and to share those thoughts with the community, because it is still very much in the earliest primordial kind of phases of evolution. We talked about some example organizations that we can draw from, and I will mention those. Like somebody was mentioning that Koala has a really interesting process for kind of coming together and breaking out into working groups and discussing things in groups all over the world, so they're kind of distributed. There was talk about different kind of constitutional convention kind of styles, coming up with proposals and then sharing feedback about those proposals, and then that kind of culminating in a constitutional convention where people kind of agree on these shared values, or even in a traditional legal sense, rights that citizens of an organization may have. And then let's see, and then we really got down to the nitty gritty of what do we want to get out of, what's the next steps for us, and that kind of comes down to the action items, where I would like to invite Luis up here to share some of the action items that he noted down, and after Luis talks, then I would also like to invite anybody else who is in a session that had a memorable action item that we haven't listed here. We would like to collect those as well. So, Luis.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, first of all, I'm going to need attention because I want to get some commitments. The risk with events like this, or events in general, is that you will be chat and then nothing happens. And then 6 months from now, we're still talking about contractorio, or still talking about governance, or our values, and so we don't want that to happen. We want to have to make some progress. So for these discussions to move forward, not going to the same level. So some action items which I think are pretty general, and I think everyone here agrees with that. If you do not, please hold. One of them is defining shared values, and just, it has to be like a discourse. Like in the beginning, just creating some document that people can contribute to. This EIP0 is a thing that we can abide by in the future. We get some draft consensus. What are our values? Do we, like we talked earlier, do we find immutability before disability? After, how does that work? Because without having that, it's very hard to make decisions as a community, whatever community means again. Very important also, another action item is to do a monthly goal. And I think they're not really committed to sort of putting that off. Definitely every single month, defining some smaller working groups that can work on individual things that we have to talk about during these couple of days, and then discuss that during this monthly goal. And finally, the last
having some signaling solutions. Yeah. And the idea is that you don't have to commit to this right now, but of these three ideas, doing a monthly call to talk about governance with working groups that are specifically working on a statement of shared values and a grants program for, the first thing that we're considering is signaling tools, and not just coin votes, but other forms of signal as well, and potentially others if other interesting governance things need to get funded. I'll share this stuff back out with the group via email and Telegram, but we would love to get other commitments from people in the room. As we said, Lane has committed to helping organize the monthly call, but we need people to join these working groups around creating a statement of shared values and a working group for the grants program. If you are interested in joining these efforts, please contact me or Luis or Lane, or just if you want to just publicly volunteer in the Telegram group, that's cool too. But I will be sending emails directly to everyone who's here. You can just reply directly to that email if you want and say, hey, I want to be part of this working group. I'm interested in contributing to grants or a statement of shared values or helping Lane run those monthly working group calls. Access control for the calls. Well, right now I think the first step is just like postponing these to like other calls, so we'll then decide these like small details in like starting calls. I think it's just like not letting these like here and just like having all the people here joining calls, or just people that are representative of the institutions here to just join the calls, and we can decide on that. Also, the idea that we had in the like workshop earlier is to get some policy statements published, because otherwise we're just gonna let this go for another 6 months or whatever, and this I don't feel it's gonna wait for 6 months, a year to happen. So like have public statements, so we have social pressure for each of us in our projects to actually work on this and move forward. Yeah, so when you guys send me emails and say I want to get involved in this, there will probably be like at least a blog post or something like that that says these people said they want to be part of this, and we'll officialize it to the degree that that's official. If you want to hard from me today or something, you want to say like I don't know, it's hard for me to do things. Yeah. Yeah. So as we said, there will be probably some follow-up to details about when those calls will be and when they'll start. We'll coordinate with Lane about that and let folks know, at least in the Telegram channel. I'm not going to just endlessly spam your email addresses and just because you attended this event. But if you want to continue being part of this conversation, at least the Telegram channel, until we find another venue to move the group. But that's it. That concludes day 2 of the EIP0